Hello and welcome to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. Unless you've been living under a stone for the last few weeks, you probably know that the FIFA World Cup starts today in the Gulf state of Qatar, a bastion of tolerance and love for the beautiful game, with a climate perfectly suited for a summer sports event. Whilst the Qatar World Cup has already provided us with some very funny moments, especially the hilariously inept paid fans commissioned by the Qatari government, the Gulf state is no laughing matter, with an estimated 5,000 migrant workers having died building the tournament stadiums. And so, this week, I turned to the man who made it all possible, the former President of FIFA, Sepp Blatter. Blatter, who won election to FIFA's highest office in 1998, was taken down in a corruption investigation in 2015, and presided over the awarding of the 2018 World Cup to Russia, and this World Cup to Qatar. The irony of that latter decision is that Sepp Blatter didn't actually want the World Cup to go to Qatar at all. Instead, he lost control of the corruption that had infested world football governance for decades prior. This somewhat punctures the image of Blatter as an all-powerful Don Corleone figure within football, instead conjuring up visions of Jim Callaghan amid the winter of discontent, or Theresa May hopelessly pleading with her own MPs over Brexit. Amid some of the other things that is going on in the world, many might claim that the awarding of something as trivial as a football tournament is unimportant. But I'm not so sure. There is, for example, something rather fitting about millions of Brits shivering in their freezing homes due to soaring energy bills, watching a tournament played and attended by the wealthiest people in the world. And despite the constant attempts to make football a more accepting sport for gay fans and players, the current World Cup and the one before it have both been hosted by two of the most intolerant countries one could hope to find. On the contrary then, the Qatar story isn't a distraction from the worst things happening in the world today, but a reflection of them. My guest for this episode is Martin Ziegler, who is the chief sports reporter for The Times and Sunday Times, and is the author of a recent article exposing the Qatar World Cup bid for that publication. As well as Blatter's career, we discuss the inconsistencies and hypocrisies inside world football, the potential for future World Cups to be hosted by unpleasant countries, whether there is too much football played today, and, on a lighter note, who Martin thinks will win the World Cup in Qatar. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Sepp Blatter. Morning, Martin. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you.
Martin, we're talking about Sepp Blatter today, principally as a commemoration of the beginning of the Qatar World Cup. Blatter was born in 1936 in Switzerland. How much do we know about his early life? And quite an important question to ask, I suppose, is there much evidence he's a big football fan?
Well, that's probably quite a good question. I mean, he had a background in different sports, sports marketing, before he got into football. I mean, he's always professed to be a big football fan, but not just football, other sports as well. So, I mean, he came into sport not directly through football, that is true. So maybe he's just saw an opportunity and seized on it.
I suppose he has to profess to be a football fan, really.
Yeah, I mean, there's no particular reason why he wouldn't be at least a sort of an occasional football fan. But he didn't come up the traditional route of going through a local football association, becoming the head of that association, going into perhaps UEFA or regional bodies, and then from that progressing into FIFA. He was somebody who, for example, just like João Havelange, his predecessor, that was the route he took. He was the head of the Brazilian FA and then became from that went into FIFA politics. Sepp Blatter he came through the administration route. He worked for Havelange in administration, and it was only in 1998 that he decided he wanted to become a football politician, as it were, and stand for, because he had been the general secretary, effectively the chief executive, and he wanted to be the FIFA president. In a way, similar to Gianni Infantino, he went up through the football administration route, was general secretary of UEFA, and then when various things happened, he decided he would run for the FIFA presidency. So some sort of similarities there.
Blatter is Swiss, and like many international organisations, FIFA is based in Switzerland. Its headquarters are in Zurich. How much of the fact do you think that he became so powerful can be explained by just long-term proximity to an organisation that was in his own country? Obviously, Havelange, you mentioned, was Brazilian. I don't think there were other Swiss presidents of FIFA before him, but do you think in this case it was important for Blatter?
Well, I mean, I think if FIFA had been headquartered in the USA, yes, no, there's absolutely sure that Sepp Blatter wouldn't have become the general secretary and then the president. So, yes, the sort of geographical location is important.
He was elected to the presidency of FIFA in 1998. In hindsight, yes, the 90s was the decade in which modern football, global football, was realised in some ways. Foreign transfers became very much the norm. The Premier League started in 1992, which was obviously so important for the English game. How did FIFA react to those changes, do you think? Do you think the organisation itself had to become different in the 1990s in order to adapt to those changes? Or was it driving some of those changes, perhaps?
Yeah, no, I think it was driving a lot of those changes. I mean, in the 80s, Adi Dassler, who was a head of Adidas, who was a sort of very, very powerful figure in sports politics, I think he identified this as a sort of way of expanding his own sporting empire, was to sort of make football become bigger and greater and more commercial. And he did a lot of that. Adidas and their sports marketing experts drove a lot of that development. And I think, maybe you can see in the 1994 World Cup in the USA, going there, that was an important turning point, expanding to 32 teams for 1998. I think it sort of worked in tandem. FIFA was driving some of it. Some of it was being pulled along by external forces. That in the UK, the sort of changes to legislation brought in following the Hillsborough disaster made the game sort of more accessible. The sort of Gaza factor, the Premier League launching, Football Italia and being shown in the UK. The game suddenly became more global, and I think that it was all sort of, that was all part of the big development, and then FIFA deciding to take the World Cup to Korea and Japan in 2002. That was just another big, taking it to Asia. That was a really important step as well. So I think, these things worked in combination.
As I said, Blatter first became FIFA's president in 1998. How is the leader decided? And are there sort of real differences of opinion about the governance of the sport that decide these elections, or is this essentially a personality contest?
Well, I mean, certainly with Blatter, it was a personality contest, but with the aid of sort of payments, political influence, whatever. So for Blatter to get elected in 1998, he needed sort of the backing of important regional confederations, basically Asia and CONCACAF, which covers North America and Central America and the Caribbean. And so he got Jack Warner, the sort of infamous president of CONCACAF on the side, and Mohammed bin Hammam, who was the head of the Asian Football Confederation. He worked very, very hard on Sepp Blatter's behalf in 1998. And infamously or famously, Blatter even referred to him this himself. Bin Hammam's people handed out brown envelopes with thousands of dollars into members of the African Football Confederation after the successful vote. This was said to be money to help develop their football associations.
Yeah, that was a big part of his appeal early on, wasn't it? That he was promising to expand African and...
There was, but I mean, I think a lot of people say this was just blatant bribery, basically, but by Bin Hammam on Blatter's behalf.
He has sort of been controversial the whole way through his FIFA presidency. He was challenged for the leadership again by Issa Hayatou in 2002. I mean, that's quite a long time before the events surrounding the Russia and Qatar World Cup bids, for which he's become remembered. Why was he already so controversial at this stage?
Well, I mean, the 2002 presidential election, there was a lot of stuff being dug up around his supporters, around Jack Warner, and the sort of the things that were going on in the background for him to win votes, and the corruption even then. I don't think he wasn't booed in the 2002. In fact, he was sort of cheered to the rafters. A few people spoke out against him, and there was some sort of quite sort of stinging condemnations, like Adam Crozier, who was then the head of the English FA, Karen Espeland, who spoke from Norway, because they were all trying to get Issa Hayatou elected instead, and UEFA had got behind Hayatou. But actually, it was a sort of landslide victory for Blatter, and it's he moved on from then and was sort of unassailable from that point.
He presided over the awarding of, I think, 5 World Cups to various host countries during his time as president. So, starting with the 2006 one in Germany, you then had South Africa in 2010, Brazil in 2014, and then the infamous editions of Russia and the one that's about to start in Qatar. We'll get to the scandal surrounding those last two later on, where I think corruption is fairly clear. But what about the first 3 in Germany, South Africa and Brazil? Is there much evidence of corruption having taken place over those decisions?
Yes, in all of them, actually. So the Germans, since emerged, paid money to a slush fund to pay associations. Franz Beckenbauer has been investigated by this. It's never been satisfactorily come to a conclusion, that investigation. But I think we certainly know that money came from the German FA, went into a special fund, and I think that no one is claiming that it was completely clean. That having said that, Sepp Blatter didn't want the 2006 World Cup to go to Germany. He wanted it to go to South Africa, and he lost out then because UEFA had fair and square behind Germany. England tried, but they suffered because they'd already done a gentleman's agreement, which they broke, not to stand against the Germans. So Germany won it, and then Sepp Blatter decided he was going to go all out 2010 to make sure that he was going to be the president who delivered the first World Cup to Africa. Put all his sort of campaigning behind it, and they won fairly easily, South Africa, but it didn't stop them effectively bribing Jack Warner for his votes. They did it in a way where they said that they were $10 million was going to help the African diaspora in the Caribbean, and they would transfer money from South Africa to the Caribbean to aid development there, and it went through a FIFA bank account, but it went straight to Jack Warner's personal account, and that money was never ever used for anything to help the development of Caribbean football at all. And the 2014 World Cup, I mean, Brazil was unchallenged in that vote. You know, they won it without a competitor because it had already been decided it was going to be in South America. But there's still some sort of fairly strong evidence that money exchanged hands for fairly early on to make sure that there was no other South American challenger.
To get back to the Africa-Asia thing, the Blatter's claim that he wanted to sort of expand football to parts of the globe which were underrepresented. Do you think that actually comes from do you think that's genuine? And do you think does that actually come from a good place in him that he wants to make football more global, or is this all just about financial trickery and sort of backhand deals?
Oh, no, it's not all about that. I mean, it's about sort of prestige, international prestige, being treated like a statesman. If you're president of FIFA, you want to go down in history as make your mark. Sepp Blatter, what he really wanted, he wanted to win the Nobel Peace Prize. So yeah, I'm sure it wasn't just financial trickery and trying to secure his political power. There was a lot of it was, I want to make my mark on history, and this is what I'm going to do. And
I suppose something that's important to kind of work out really is clearly there was sort of deep corruption and issues within this organisation before 2010. If you go back to sort of the period before Blatter and Havelange were running this organisation to the sort of 50s, 60s, 70s, I'm curious to know, has FIFA always had this sort of cloud of corruption and seediness surrounding it, or is this a relatively new reputation?
I mean, I think that, back in those days there wasn't that sort of competition with really high stakes competition to hold the World Cup. So although there was a sort of a feeling that the things were done within FIFA which weren't always fair, and people were some countries were given special treatment. I mean, the Brazilians, for example, thought that FIFA completely were in the sort of aiding and abetting England to win the World Cup in 1966. So they even made formal complaints about it. So I think that there is certainly a feeling that FIFA then had its own influences and its own sort of strategies which weren't entirely fair. But in terms of the sort of blatant sort of paying money for votes, that really didn't come in until the 1990s, because actually before then it was sort of there wasn't such a demand for it, basically, and the prestige and the finances were nothing like the Olympics. Actually, at the time, the Olympics were bigger then. But both the Olympics and the World Cup, in terms of the sort of evidence of corruption and bribery being paid to host both those events, that effectively came out towards the sort of late 80s, 90s.
I think if you look back at sort of old editions of the World Cup, like 78, say, it's quite visible the relative lack of money that was behind these things then, compared to, say, 20, 25 years later.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. There's still plenty of shenanigans going on. 1978 World Cup. Infamously, Argentina bribed their way to the final, but there we go.
Yeah, definitely not a good example of of an open process. But if we think about Blatter as a kind of person and the qualities that he displayed to be able to do this sort of stuff, how do you think he came across? I think you interviewed him. What sort of person was he like? If you had to sort of describe his character traits.
He undoubtedly charismatic, that's for sure, and he, I think, got on with people from all backgrounds. That's for sure. So he is quite a good sort of, felt he was somebody who could draw support from all parts of the world. He was obviously very canny, politically astute, and must have had a strong business sense and commercial sense and instincts that were right, which helped make the FIFA into a multi-billion-dollar organisation.
I imagine he was quite good at, it's not a very professional term, but schmoozing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm sure he was. I mean, if he was quite sort of, he was a very jovial person, and he liked cracking jokes and laughing and teasing people. So I remember we're at the 2014 World Cup. He'd seen something I'd written about his nephew Philippe Blatter, and came up and started sort of joking with me that, do you think my nephew is running FIFA? Ha ha ha! I'm the only one in charge, sort of thing. And he was so he was like, yeah, he liked sort of. He was a sort of twinkly eyed character.
Was it obvious that there was another side to him?
Well, I think it was always known that he was the ultimate pragmatist. So he may not have got his hands dirty in terms of taking bribes himself, but he was happy to sort of, turn a blind eye to things that were happening with other people doing so. When it came to Jack Warner, basically awarded him TV rights for almost $1, I think. The Caribbean World Cup TV rights. Jack Warner was given them for $1, and then he was allowed to sell them and take all the money himself. So those sort of things. Blatter was, he had this idea that he wouldn't take any bribes himself, and he didn't need to because he's getting these huge bonuses, like $12 million every 4 years, on top of his annual salary, which was pretty high anyway. He didn't need to take bribes. He was incredibly richly rewarded as FIFA president, and he just let other people below him who kept him in power enrich themselves, I think. And not just Jack Warner, the South Americans as well, the 3 South American FIFA members who were always supportive of Blatter, at least in the early days. They all earned millions and millions of dollars in bribes, one way and another.
Somebody I think we should probably mention is Michel Platini. Who's obviously one of the best footballers of all time, the French footballer. He was elected as the head of UEFA in 2007. How important was the relationship between Blatter and Platini and FIFA and UEFA in terms of providing some of these kickbacks and constructing a system that was based on sort of bribery and corruption?
Well, Platini had been Blatter's special advisor in the 1998 World Cup and worked for him for a couple of years then at that time. He then became president of UEFA, as you said. Well, the importance of the relationship, I think, was in 2011 when Blatter was facing a challenge to the presidency from his old supporter, Mohammed bin Hammam. He needed Platini on board to fend off this challenge from a guy who was distributing his largesse throughout Africa and the Caribbean and other parts of Asia. As a serious challenge to Blatter, and he needed Platini's backing. So again, Platini's not one of these people who would overtly, like Warner or the Brazilians, be taking huge sums of money as backhanders. But what he did do is say to Sepp Blatter, you still owe me 2 million Swiss francs from 1998, like 13 years ago, as part of a verbal agreement we made then. Blatter says, okay, well, I'll get FIFA to pay it to you without a sort of blink, and that's what happened. So that led to both of them being banned from football. It's referred to as a disloyal payment. There's a Swiss criminal investigation which went to court. They were both cleared earlier this year. Took a long time for that to come out, but I think there's no doubt that whether that is a overt sweetener or not, it's certainly a very strange way of running a business and one of the biggest sports organisations in the world.
If we look at the events of 2010, the hosts to the 2010 World Cup were just both to the 2018 and 2022 World Cups were both decided in December 2010. How long had there been plans to host a World Cup in Qatar, or at least discussions about doing that?
So initially they'd tried to bid for the Olympics in Qatar before then, and they didn't even make it to the shortlist. The IOC refused to sort of countenance the idea of holding the Olympics in the autumn when it was cooler, which is what the Qataris had wanted. So that was blocked. But so instead they sort of pushed ahead with the World Cup bid. And I think it was officially announced in about 2009 or 2008 perhaps. And from then on, it was seen as going to be between Qatar and the USA. But even then, I think most people thought it was going to go to the USA. And for a lot of people, when Qatar won it, it was a huge shock. That's for sure, including Sepp Blatter, actually.
Really?
Yeah. He, I think he realised something was up, but he'd been fighting very hard for USA. He went probably from a sort of commercial point of view. He wanted the USA to have it, and when I interviewed him in 2016, he just said, "Oh, look, you can see from my face when I opened the envelope what I thought about it," because he blames Platini for that, because he says the sort of political influences from President Sarkozy of France pushed Platini to go with Qatar and take a couple of people of the European members with him. And he had this plan in his head that it was going to be Russia for 2018 and the USA for 2022, and suddenly the Qataris came in one way and another, got won in the end fairly convincingly.
So if we just take one step back there, you mentioned the Russia World Cup for 2018, which obviously Blatter was quite supportive of. Again, can we run the sort of corruption audit on that one?
So it's interesting with the Russia World Cup. So they had the advantage. Blatter was behind them. I think there's nobody seriously thinks that Russia got that completely without paying bribes. Jack Warner and Chuck Blazer, by Blazer's own testimony, took bribes to vote for all the World Cup hosts that they possibly could. Blazer went to Russia, met Putin himself. Jack Warner, I think he basically demanded money from everybody to vote for anything. But when the Michael Garcia, the US attorney who was appointed to investigate the World Cup bidding in 2014, reported back, the Russians said that they didn't have any. He asked for all the emails and servers from all the bidding committees, and the Russians said that they didn't have any because they'd rented their computers and they'd all been scrapped and destroyed. So they didn't have any emails, which is convenient to say the least. But I almost certainly Russia they were certainly very confident beforehand that they were going to win.
So why was Blatter not able to get his way on the 2022 World Cup then?
Because the people who he could influence went other way, went to Qatar, like Platini for a start. The three South Americans, who it has been, according to the US Department of Justice in 2020, the three South Americans took bribes to vote for Qatar. It hasn't stated in the indictment who paid them. The Qatar Big Committee has always insisted it behaved properly. Mohammed bin Hammam, who was the FIFA Executive Committee member who was campaigning for Qatar, he wasn't part of the bid committee officially, which was a sort of a paper wall, but was quite convenient because there is evidence that he did pay Jack Warner, for example. So it's one of those. It was too much for Blatter to deal with. Lots of people on side. Qatar had Sandro Rosell, the Barcelona president, working for them. They did a sort of deal with Spain that they would work almost like collude, that they would help Spain's bid for 2018 and Spain would help their bid for 2022. So that meant they had Spain's FIFA member backing them. So a combination of factors really meant that Blatter couldn't get his way.
I mean, it's interesting, the kind of public perception of Blatter is as this kind of shadowy figure within world football who controlled everything and nothing could get past him. That doesn't really chime with that. No, I mean, there were times when Blatter couldn't get his way. He didn't get it with South Africa for 2006, and he didn't get it with the USA for 2022. Yeah. I mean, it suggests a sort of weakness overall as a figure, really, as somebody who kind of lost control of his own orchestra. I don't think that, but I think for him it was a constant struggle. I think when you rely on people who are essentially crooked to generate your support, then if they turn against you because somebody else is, or that they themselves decide they want to share a greater share of that power, then you're in trouble. And I think that's what happened with Blatter. I mean, I think it was a constant. As he saw it, he needed to sort of constantly work to keep his position, and that was the most important thing to him. And if he could get the World Cups where he wanted them to him, then so much the better. But he couldn't do that. But on the other hand, he did manage to keep his position, and actually it was only after 2002 the presidential election never actually went to a vote again. He was politically, at least he was powerful, if not in terms of being able to get his way on those two World Cups. I mean, from what you've said, it sounds as if the briberies and the corruption weren't sort of like a bug within the system. Eventually, they became sort of the system itself. Like the way the system worked was entirely built around this corruption. The briberies kind of.
No, I wouldn't say it's entirely that. I'd say it was an important part of it. I mean, I think there are other things. Well, for example, people who from poorer countries who have they all each have a vote. The president of the Football Association, they all have a vote, and the money they get from FIFA is not only very important for the organisation, but also for the people themselves. And the president of that FA will get free travel and per diems to go to World Cups and various meetings and a very nice life. So if those people, it's not direct bribery, but if those people can be kept sweet by the fact that the income that FIFA is providing to them, then I mean that is a really important tool to keep power, and that's what Infantino does now, basically. He talks about providing more money for the national associations as much as he can. Well, that was going to be my next question. How better do you think this situation is now that Blatter has gone? He obviously
resigned the FIFA presidency in 2015. And Gianni Infantino, Italian administrator, is now in charge.
Well, I think Infantino is wise enough to know that if he, those days where people like Chuck Blazer and Jack Warner were fairly overt in taking money and bribes, that that can't no longer exist because that's too damaging. Blatter he was a bit of a sort of Teflon coated figure. He could brush off those sorts of things. But in this day and age, I think that's far too great a risk for anybody really involved at the top of football or Olympics. So Infantino, he is still very, very keen to keep power and very keen to grow FIFA and make his mark and do everything, but he has to do it by the building support amongst the national associations, and he has decided that means the ones who aren't in Europe, basically. So FIFA's had a very strong push in Africa. It's got effectively taken over control of the African Football Confederation, CAF, and again, it's all a lot of the thrust is trying to provide more money to the national associations, more chances of getting to major competitions. That's why we've seen the World Cup expanding to 48 teams for the next World Cup. And Infantino, he's flirted almost constantly since he took power with Saudi Arabia, because they've got huge amounts of money, which he wants to harness for his visions of maybe a Club World Cup or some other tournaments. And by growing the FIFA coffers, he can hand out more money and build his support and remain where he is for as long as possible.
Blatter criticised the Premier League on a number of occasions. Do you think he's anti-British?
I think he had a sort of love-hate relationship with the British, really. I think he thought they were a bit arrogant, and we developed the game. The British were all saying that we invented football. We're the home of football. And there was also before Havelange took over, Stanley Rouse was the FIFA president, who was a school teacher effectively, and ran FIFA on a sort of colonial basis. For example, didn't like sport being interfered with politics, was reluctant for the South African boycott to take place during the apartheid years, initially at least. So I think he liked some parts of the English, the history of the English game and things like that, and accepted it for it being a very important association. But I think he also felt that they were amongst his most vocal critics as much as anything else, and also people who didn't understand football politics, which is probably fair enough, that the English FA has never been very good at that.
I want to discuss the Qatar World Cup and the reaction to it in this country. Support for Qatar hosting the World Cup in Britain is extremely low. But we're also a country that has accepted the foreign purchase and ownership of Manchester City by the UAE, Newcastle by Saudi Arabia. And if you go further afield, I went to watch Paris Saint-Germain a few weeks ago, and they're owned by Qatar. Do you think that, in spite of all the indignation at Qatar hosting the World Cup, do you think actually ordinary football fans are more to blame for the current predicament than they might like to admit to, because of what they have put up with, especially over the last sort of 20 years? We've become very accustomed to very unpleasant people having a lot of influence in football, even before this decision.
I mean, you can see from a fan's point of view, it's quite difficult because, on the one hand, you have governments doing multi-billion-pound deals with Qatar, Saudi Arabia. Qatar owns huge amounts of properties in London, other parts of England, and yet the football fans are expected to be the people who sort of take the political and moral high ground. So you can see why some of them think, perhaps think why should we be blamed for what football has done and the World Cup being held there. At the other hand, they can also think the Qatar World Cup, we're having to move the World Cup's always been in June, July, suddenly it's in November, December. So that you can see why that's very unpopular with football fans. Did they get it fairly? Is it probably not? Is the answer to that? So you can see why there's people don't like that. Human rights. Why are we holding the World Cup in a country where it's not a true democracy, where the migrant workers are treated so terribly, even though there have been and there have been major improvements in workers' conditions since 2010 when they won the World Cup. There's still been lots and lots of terrible, terrible stories coming out about that. So you can see why fans think, why is the World Cup being held in Qatar? But on the other hand, you can still see the governments are happy to maintain very close relationships with these countries. It's a predicament, isn't it? Which way do you go, and do you hold should the Middle East be able to hold the World Cup and major sports events, and if so, where? And the whole awarding of big sports events is absolutely a minefield, really. Once you take a human rights aspect to it, then, which I think is important, but then that creates lots of problems. I mean, should China ever host a major sporting event? Should Nigeria, where homosexuality is legal, should that be allowed to bid for the African Cup of Nations? All these things have actually raised some really important questions, which I think is probably a good thing for sport in the longer term, because if there's one legacy of Qatar, it is that there is going to be perhaps more focus on these issues than there has ever been before when it comes to the awarding of major sports events.
It's amazing to think that the last World Cup was in Russia.
I know. I mean,
24 years ago.
That's right. I mean, Russia sort of got away with things fairly lightly. I mean, there was some sort of common denomination because they brought in some new laws to sort of restrict the promotion of homosexuality, and Peter Tatchell campaigning very strongly on that. But the world was different then. But although there were signs that Putin was already cracking down on opposition, and had they had invaded Crimea and all those sorts of issues around, which has led to what's happened in Ukraine in the last year. Things weren't quite as Russia wasn't seen in quite the light it is now. That's for sure. So, I mean, there's no way anyone would countenance going to Russia in the short term for a major sports event, but probably not while Putin is in power. But yeah, it's incredible. It does seem incredible now that not that long ago it was in Russia.
Well, and that the Champions League final this year was supposed to be in St. Petersburg, and it had to be moved at the last minute. If you think about the England and Wales teams that are going and the associations that support them, the journalists and the pundits that are going to go and watch this, what does a sort of principled stand against the regime look like, do you think? I mean, this is entirely personal because it gets to questions of how much you think sport should be in politics. But I'm just interested to hear your take.
It's an interesting question for a journalist, because a journalist is meant to sort of report on what's happening rather than necessarily being a sort of campaigner, I think. So so it's an interesting one for those. I mean, for example, I know Gary Neville's coming for criticism because he's criticised some things around Qatar in the past, but he's now going to the World Cup, being paid by beIN Sport, the Qatari state-owned broadcaster, to be a pundit. I mean, I do think it's important that the players do show some sort of display of consciousness about what's been happening in Qatar, in particular in regard to the migrant workers, because I think that is a really big issue, and absolutely about equal rights in terms of LGBT people and women, all those sorts of issues. I think that's important too. If there was one thing that I think would be important, is for the countries to push FIFA and Qatar to have a centre for migrant workers, where they can, once the World Cup circus moves on, there is some place where migrant workers can go and get support, legal support, if they can't get their passports or they haven't been paid or whatever, somewhere that they can go to get help, because at the moment there's nothing for them. And I think that if the countries taking part can play their part to get that agreed, I think that would be a really important step.
I mean, you mentioned FIFA again there. I think in a way the important thing is not that necessarily that the players and the associations criticise Qatar, because in 2 months nobody will remember Qatar, whereas FIFA's going to go on carrying on making these decisions. I mean, what if they give it to China in 20 years' time, or some other unpleasant regime that comes up? I think it's probably them that need to come in for the most criticism here, isn't it? Because the Qataris by themselves are not that powerful. It's FIFA that are the corrupt kind of gatekeepers to all this.
I think, I mean, there is a good chance that Saudi Arabia is going to bid for the 2030 World Cup. So this, I think, is an opportunity, Qatar, for people to really focus on what sort of guarantees are needed, and or also a debate about whether should the World Cup go to Saudi Arabia, where the human rights are, say, restricted as they are now. I think that's a really important thing. I mean, the death penalty still exists for homosexuality in Saudi Arabia on paper, and the sort of political freedom is hugely restricted. So I think this is going to be a really, really interesting couple of years for FIFA in terms of how it approaches those very, very challenging issues. And if Saudi Arabia does go ahead and bid, what happens as a result of it, and what FIFA says about it, and what it does about it, and what the country does about all those challenges. So if there's one thing positive that might come out of Qatar, it is this sort of focus on the countries who are bidding for World Cups in the future.
Just on a slightly different note, Arsene Wenger carried out a sort of report recommendation for FIFA last year, I think, when he said that there should be a World Cup every 2 years. As you said, there's going to be 48 teams at the 2026 World Cup in North America. Even in club football, if you look at things like the Conference League, there's kind of a proliferation of football. This is going to be sacrilege to lots of football fans, me asking this question. But I did recently watch an interview with Brian Clough from the late 70s where he made exactly this point. He argued in favour of this. Do you think there's too much football?
Personally, yes, I do. I just think less is more. So, I think expanding the World Cup to 48 teams is not good. I think UEFA actually just in the last couple of months decided not to increase the European Championships from 24 to 32 teams. I mean, I don't think they did it from any sort of motive other than the fact that they realised the qualifying competitions would then become completely unattractive to broadcasters. So that's why they ditched the idea. But I mean, it's very, very unusual for the football competitions not to expand. The Champions League's expanding. But can the World Cup go beyond 48 teams? I don't think it, I mean, that would seem, 48 teams seems crazy as it is. I think there's far too much football at the moment, and I don't think the next World Cup 48 teams is going to be particularly exciting, to be honest. At least not the early stages. I think it's going to be.
Well, there's going to be a lot of crap in there.
Yeah,
not to put too fine a point on it.
Yeah, it's just if games are become one-sided and unexciting, that damages the product, and people vote with their feet, don't they? So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I imagine the first World Cup, because of where it is, it will be a success. It's just longer term whether they can sustain that.
Finally, the World Cup starts in 2 weeks' time. This will be going out on the day that the World Cup does actually start. On a slightly lighter note than what we've been talking about, do you have a sense of what's going to happen? Can you pick a winner?
On the pitch?
Are you brave enough?
Yeah, well, I went through. There is a sort of predictor which the Times has got, where you sort of pick the group winners and the second place teams, and then you then select the winner of the round of 16 and then the quarterfinals. And so I went through all that and came up with Brazil as my winner. So that's where my money is. Okay. And I'm still happy to stick with that, actually. I think.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, I think this could be their year, because they've not really had a really strong team, I think, for a long time. I know that they won the Olympics in 2016, and a lot of their players from that have come through. So, yeah, I think that they'll be there or thereabouts for sure.
Do you think the fact that it's going to be in the middle of the season do you think that's going to have a big impact on how it plays out? Do you think there'll be more upsets, more injuries?
No, I mean, actually, players should be fresher in a way, because they've not had a long season, grueling season behind them. On the other hand, we are coming out of the sort of pandemic where fixture congestion has been crazy, and there have been various issues that have happened over the last 2 seasons, which has caused a lot of matches to be played in a shorter space of time. So there may be a hangover from that, but I think generally footballers should be fresher than usual. So certainly the European-based ones. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out. In the past, England have sort of benefited from having a sort of lengthy preparation period before the matches. They haven't got that. But obviously none of the other countries have. So for those countries where that is an important factor, that might be a disadvantage.
Martin, thank you. That was very enjoyable. It's slightly left field conversation on my podcast, which is usually about politics rather than sport. But obviously, Blatter has become a political figure in his own unique way. If people want to read your analysis in the run up to the World Cup and about football more generally, where can they go?
They go to the Times online. By the time you hear this, I should have done a big piece on the whole Qatar vote and looking back at how it all happened. So it'll be there. I hope you enjoy reading it.
Thanks.
Okay, cheers then, Tom. See you later.
Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and, for good measure, leave us a review. You can also follow The Hated and the Dead on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, so you never miss new content.